My name is Mary Moynihan, and I'm delighted to be asked to talk about Mary Elmes. And Mary Elmes was an extraordinary woman from Cork, and she is the first Irish person to be nominated as Righteous Among Nations for her work saving Jewish children from the Nazi gas chambers during World War II. And how I first heard about Mary Elmes was in 2016, when Smashing Towns was working on a project called Women, War and Peace. And as part of that project, we were working with organisations from Ireland, Spain, Germany and Poland. And what we had to do for that project was to explore women's stories from World War II. So each country was to look at their women's stories from their own country and bring those stories together, and then look at those stories and see how they could inspire the creation of a piece of theatre and a film. So in Ireland, I didn't know, or I knew very little of the stories of Irish women who were involved during World War II, and Ireland was neutral at that time. And as a little story behind that, at that same time, Smashing Towns was looking at women's stories from 1916, and we had been approached and asked to create some theatre work around the women's stories from 1916. And again, I remember thinking to myself, well, there was no women involved in 1916, and that's what we would have been led to believe. And at that time, research was beginning to happen, and as it turned out, it's like this invisibility blanket over these stories. When you take that blanket away, there are hundreds of stories that are actually there, they're just not being told. And there were over 200 women were involved in the 1916 Easter Rising, and these stories are being told today by historians, male and female, and they're being uncovered and made available to the public. And I suppose it comes from what I would call a narrative of maleness, and the fact that sometimes history is told to us through a male lens, and that male stories, rightly so, are being told, but to the exclusion of women's stories. So it really is about balance and bringing this balance and creating a different narrative and bringing women's stories back into history and telling these stories today. So we discovered all these wonderful 1916 stories, and then we said we're looking at women's stories from World War II, and I wondered would it be the same thing. And as I said, I didn't know any stories from World War II, so the Irish Jewish Museum in Dublin, in Portobello, kindly offered to give us a talk, and we had all the artists from the different countries in Dublin at that time. So we went down to the Irish Jewish Museum, and we were given a wonderful talk there. And that's where I first heard the names Mary Elmes and Etty Steinberg. Etty Steinberg was an Irish woman who was known to have been murdered at Auschwitz. And Mary Elmes, as I said, was an Irish woman from Cork whose life was also caught up in the Second World War. Mary was born in Cork, and her mother was actually active in the suffragette movement in Ireland at that time, in the Munster Women's Franchise League. And Mary was a very bright student, and she ended up going to Trinity College in Dublin, where she studied Spanish and French. And then she went to the London School of Economics, where she studied, and then she won a scholarship to Geneva. And it was in Geneva that she heard about the Spanish Civil War. And what Mary did was she decided to go and support the Spanish people who were like refugees in their own country. So the Spanish people who were on the run from the fascists. So very briefly, the Spanish Civil War was in 1936, and Mary was involved firstly with the London Ambulance Unit, where she arrived into Almeria, and she was involved in humanitarian work. And at that time, Malaga had just fallen to the fascists. So there is a coast road between Malaga and Almeria, and the city of Malaga fell. There was dreadful atrocities happening to the local population by the fascists, and thousands of people fled out of the city along this coastal road, where they were bombed from the sea and from the sea and from the sky by the fascist forces. And Mary was there when those refugees were fleeing. So it was, I suppose, a baptism of fire, if you like, to arrive into this massacre. And Mary stayed on until Spain fully fell to Franco. And at the very last moment, she then went with other members of the Quaker Association, where they went over the mountains into France. And in France, a lot of the Spanish refugees who had fled from Franco were, instead of finding refuge, a lot of them were incarcerated in camps in France. And Mary did return to Ireland, but she came back to France then, as she said, to support her Spanish friends. And she worked in a camp called Reef Salt. So Reef Salt was a camp near Perpignan where a lot of the Spanish refugees were incarcerated. And Mary was working there. She did things like set up a library, provide school books, look after the children, a lot of different things. And then when France fell, when there was the Vichy government was in power, but when all of France fell to the Nazis, they started to ship Jewish people who were also in this camp in Reef Salt off to the Nazi gas chambers. And Mary and the other people working in the camps were aware that the women and the children and the men were being shipped off to their deaths, basically. So Mary and other people in the camps started to rescue people from the camps. And from talking to, we know from talking to and listening to Mary's family today that Mary saved over 200 lives, women, children and men, and people of all nationalities, so Jewish people and other people. And, you know, the stories of her putting children in the boot of her car and trying to sneak them out of the camps and bringing them over the mountains. And it's an extraordinary story. So after the war, she went back. She stayed living in France, married a Frenchman and had her family in France. And nothing was known of her story until, I suppose, the last 10 years. And as I said, we found out through Bernard Wilson. And when I created a play then based on Mary Elmes' life, and the play is called The Woman is Present, Women's Stories of World War II, and there's myself and other artists involved. And one of the pieces in it that I was involved with Fiona Bond Thompson is about the life story of Mary Elmes. And when we put that play on, it was seen by a journalist called Clodagh Finn, and Clodagh went on to research Mary's life, and she wrote a book called A Time to Risk All, and there's been documentaries made about Mary, and just last year there was a bridge which was opened in Cork in honour of Mary. So I think it's important we remember her story because she is an example of someone who sacrificed or risked her life to look after strangers and to look after refugees. And I think there's a very important message in that today when we should be welcoming refugees into our countries. We should be looking after them, treating them with dignity and respect. And it's very important that stories like Mary Elmes are told in our schools because I think they're wonderful role models. So that's the life story of Mary Elmes.